I just welcome to pick up and deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I step off the train and deliver an episode to you while I stroll home. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good evening, listeners. It is a blustery, cool Monday night here in suburban Chicago. It is the end of November. I'm way behind schedule if I want to hit episode 400 by the end of the year, which is usually my goal. So I don't know if I'll make that or not, but we'll see how it goes. I may have to play a little catch up next year. I just saw something kind of funny. When I get off the train, it's about 6 o'clock right now, and when I get off the train at this hour of night, there's often a lot of business people and other suits and stuff walking home. I saw this guy get off the train, and he was getting picked up by somebody who was waiting for him, but they didn't see him, so they were like driving around, and he was sort of following after them. It was pretty funny. At least I thought it was funny. It wouldn't have been funny if it was happening to me, but Schadenfreude and all that, I guess. No one picked me up. I have to walk home in the cold. Just kidding, I don't mind at all. Mostly because I get to talk to you fine folks. Well, I mentioned in the episode that I released before Thanksgiving that I had an idea for a Thanksgiving episode, and even though it is now after Thanksgiving, I'm still going to do the Thanksgiving episode. And so here it is. My idea for a Thanksgiving-themed episode of Pick Up and Deliver is focused around the idea of gorging. Now, I know that's a little insensitive, perhaps, that there are a lot of people for whom Thanksgiving is not a holiday of gorging, that people who are food insecure or have various problems that keep them from having a gigantic meal at Thanksgiving. I certainly don't mean to be insensitive to that, but I guess this is where I am insensitive anyway. But it is part of the tradition of Thanksgiving in America that we prepare a gigantic feast, and that is the thing that we eat, right? I can't help but remember the leftover lament in Christmas Story after Ralphie's neighbor's dogs eat the Christmas turkey, and Ralphie laments how they aren't going to get to have turkey sandwiches or turkey soup or turkey, all the things that they would have after the meal because there would be so much leftover food. So I was thinking I thought it might be interesting to talk about games where you have a smorgasbord of stuff. And I did not prepare a list ahead of time, so I'm just going to kind of work off the top of my head, and we'll see how many games I come up with by the time I get home. I hope you don't mind this slightly more improvisational episode. There it is. So the first game I want to mention is Underwater Cities. This is the Vladimir Suchi game from Delicious Games. And at the beginning of the game, you start with a relatively modest pile of resources and a few cards. And over the course of the game, you build up your cities. And if you are being careful about marshaling your production capacity, each time you get to one of the production phases, of which there are 3 in the game, you get a bigger and bigger pile of stuff. Generally, the second production phase, right before rounds 9, 10, 11, or 10, 11, 12, or 9, 10, 11, I don't know, whatever, right before the last 3 rounds, the pile of stuff that you get coming out of that production phase feels enormous. You have all this money, you have all these green, you have all this kelp, you have all this steel. If you're doing well, you have all the pink, whatever it's called, super kelp, or I don't remember what it's called, but you have all of this stuff. Now, honestly, what happens usually is by the time you've played 2 or 3 turns, you probably spent a lot of it because it goes just as fast as you got it. But there is almost no better spot in gaming, from my experience, to have this giant pile of stuff get piled in front of your player board and really feel like you have everything you could possibly want to eat than that second to last production phase in Underwater Cities. Now, you do have one more production phase after that, but it's generally muted because you're not actually going to use any of the resources, so there's a whole sort of resolution thing that happens. So really, it's the second to last one where you're still going to play a few more turns and you're going to spend all those resources that really just feels opulent. So that's my first giant pile of stuff game, Underwater Cities. The second game I'd like to mention that feels that way sometimes is Everdell. Now, Everdell is a tricky beast because sometimes it feels absolutely Agricola level starvation. I've had games of Everdell where I am really struggling to find enough resources to do pretty much anything. But usually toward the end of a game of Everdell, if you've been playing well, what you find is not a shortage of resources, but rather a shortage of turns. Because in Everdell, you have a limited number of turns based on the combos of cards that you get and the very limited number of workers that you have. In the first phase of the game, you only have 2 workers, then you have 3, then you have 5. And boy howdy, those 5 workers go really fast in that last season when you're trying to get all the stuff that you need to get and you really just want a few more resources. Actually, I think you have 6 in that last phase. And what you want to do is build more cards, but you're out of room. You want to go to the spaces that get you points. You know, sometimes I'll go to that space where I discard 5 cards to go to a particular space that's going to be worth 5 points. There's all this sort of like really delicious stuff that you can do, and you're choosing between a variety of different ways to spend the giant pile of stuff that you've got. Like I said, Everdell, this is a mixed bag. There are games I've played where I'm running a very fine engine without much extra waste. But it's not uncommon to have a big pile of stuff, and my wife is really good at that. Often we'll be playing and she'll have a whole bunch of resources in front of her. Always makes me really jealous. So Everdell would be the second example of a game where I feel like you get this giant pile of stuff and you get to decide what to do with it. Now there's a couple other situations that emerge in games that are sort of tangential to this, but as I've been thinking about games where you get a giant pile of stuff, I'm particularly inclined to think of 3 games that have the payout aspect. They feel really good about the stuff you accumulate, even though it's not quite the same as the smorgasbord of opportunity that I've been talking about. And those are, weirdly, the board game Obsession, the board game Android Netrunner, or the card game Android Netrunner, and the card game Innovation. Now, these are wildly different games in many, many ways, but all 3 of them have something that happens sometimes that I always feel great about, which is if you get the right combination of turns, suddenly you get this big influx of stuff. In Obsession, a good combination of turns, and suddenly you've got 1,500 to 2,000 pounds, which will get you through 2 or 3 rounds of buying really opulent rooms. You know, in Netrunner, you play the right combination of cards, suddenly you've got this giant pile of money that you can use to, if you're the corp, you can use to shut down the runner, or if you're the runner, you can use to buy your way into the corp. And in Innovation, every now and again, you'll get like this really great combo where you get this giant pile of cards or a giant pile of points. I had one game a little while ago where I had to draw a card, and if it had a certain symbol on it, I got to put it in my hand and draw another card. And I got like 8 in a row that had that symbol. I just got this giant pile of cards. And then I used another card that let me trade all the highest cards in my score pile with all the highest cards in my hand, and suddenly I put all 8 of those cards that I had gotten right into my score pile. It felt really, really good. And that's the sort of thing, you know, you have to have that giant pile of stuff in order to do that. Now, that isn't quite the same as the feeling I was talking about with Underwater Cities and Everdell, but I thought these other 3 games did have an aspect of that I felt was worthy of mention here. In keeping with Underwater Cities in particular, and Everdell also with regard to the harvest phase, games that have a really good harvest phase are always pretty fun. You know, I think Scythe does this a little bit when you use one of the produce actions and you manage to get a whole bunch of stuff, especially late in the game. It's really fun to, you know, a bunch of workers and they're spread over a variety of places, and maybe you've gotten a thing that lets you get the windmill as well. And then you do the produce action, and suddenly you've got this giant pile of resources everywhere. That's feels really good to build up that smorgasbord. Or, you know, Everdell I mentioned already. At the beginning of turn 4, all of your green resources trigger, and you get this giant pile of stuff. But even a game like Agricola, which normally feels so resource starved, when you get the right combination of cards, and you end up farming clay or really pulling a lot of wheat out of the ground, or, you know, you get a couple pairs of animals, you get a pair of sheep and a pair of pigs, and suddenly you're breeding animals like crazy. Those games feel really good when they let you trigger those kinds of vast accumulation of points or of resources. And you really only get to do that if you're being super efficient. So in those first couple games, or in all of these games so far, what I've talked about is the wonderful feeling of having all of this stuff available to you, which, as I said, is the perspective I was sort of thinking about with regard to Thanksgiving. What does it mean to have this idea of tons of stuff available to you, like a big smorgasbord or a feast? The part I'm leaving out is the inevitable stomachache, the unpleasantness of having and eating all of that stuff. One place that this comes up is in games where you have to feed your people. And, Agricola comes back again, but I've had this really significant problem in Zolk in the Mayan calendar, and to some degree in Trickerion. In these three games, you have the pain of having overeaten, because when you take more workers, you then have to make sure that you can feed and or pay them. And these games are brutal in their judgment and penalties if you're unable to pay or feed those workers that you said you were going to pay or feed. And I think that, the place where we see that happen most is in these games with this harvest mode. That feels a little bit like the stomachache effect that we see in Thanksgiving when you have eaten too much from this generous meal that you set up. I guess the last thing I'll mention is a stereotype that I haven't really experienced very much at Thanksgiving, but certainly does come up in games, which is misunderstandings leading to blow-ups. Like I said, my family Thanksgivings have been generally pretty mild regarding this sort of thing. But in terms of games, I've certainly experienced it before, where somebody misunderstanding a rule or somebody not planning for a thing properly then feels really upset when the game doesn't go their way. Particularly a misunderstood rule, I think, is a really brutal way to have that sort of thing happen, because generally you don't plan for a mistake to happen. A good example would be when we played Cascadia this weekend. My father-in-law misunderstood the scoring rule for the foxes and was reasonably upset when they didn't score the way he thought they would. Now, they did in fact score pretty well, but they didn't score exactly what he thought they were going to. And so he was irritated that he had misunderstood the rule, or that we hadn't explained it well enough. And the complicated thing about a game like that is that it's a little of both. As the teacher, it's obligated on me to make sure that my people who are playing the game I've taught understand the way the game works. At the same time, on the player's end, it's really important that you ask if you don't understand what's happening in a game. You don't just assume that you understand the rules. And, I think Thanksgiving, stories of Thanksgiving, people's unpleasant family interactions at Thanksgiving tend to fit that narrative of trouble thanks to complexities of experience, thanks to miscommunications, and thanks to unpleasant thoughts, and thanks to people not asking when they should have asked, and so on. So, dear listener, what kinds of experiences did you have with Thanksgiving this year, if you had one? And how does that translate into board game experiences? Are there smorgasbord games that I missed? What about miscommunications and the way that those interfere with your gaming experience? Head over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and share your thoughts in the comments there. Or email me, Brendan at Rattlebox Games. I'd be happy to hear from you. I also play asynchronously on most platforms as Wombat929, and I'd be happy to play a game with you. So, thanks for joining me on my walk today. I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.